to this crazy.
Sorry, that was me.
All right. Got to this crazy place of running a 1,100-mile dog race at age 50. And I came a long way from my beginnings to that point. I was born in Connecticut and daughter of two very adventurous parents who had lived hard knocks during World War II in that era. They had me late. And so I was born into a really awesome family that at that point in time was ready to enjoy life. And for them, that meant doing things outdoors and really following their passion. We had hunting dogs, but they were also family dogs. So early on, I was drawn into a lot of different sports, mostly winter sports. Skiing was my passion. To wilderness adventure, I went camping. I never loved my family more than when we were all filthy, dirty camping in a little tent on a river in upstate New York. You know, it was great fun pulling up rocks and finding creatures underneath them and all that. And I was also very infatuated with our dog, several in particular. So then I moved through college on the East Coast, and I moved to Alaska. And that's a long story. You'll have to read the book to understand all of that. But I got married early on to a mountain climber. I was climbing mountains at the time. And we had two children. And soon after we had them, we acquired one retired old sled dog. He was 7 years old. He was limping. He walked into our house at Christmas. I was very down in the dumps. And a friend said, "I'm bringing you a present." And I said, "I don't want a present." And he said, "I'm coming over anyway." And he brought me one of his retired sled dogs. And the dog walked into the house, ran to our Christmas tree, lifted his leg and moved in, and he became the centerpiece of our family. And in the course of the next 15 years, my kids were, I think, 5 and 7 at the time. We acquired a bunch more dogs. By the time they went to college, there were 20 dogs in our backyard. And the kids had raced sled dogs for fun, matter of a countdown, and go around a course and come back. And sometimes the sled would come back with the dogs and no child. And other times the child would come back and there was no sled. And other times the other mushers would give the, kids, the guy that started behind you, a ride in. It was all very exciting and dramatic. But they went off to college, leaving this beloved group of dogs in our backyard. And my response to the empty nest, which is the term of I don't know, reality of when you have two kids close together and then they're all of a sudden gone, parents get a little off kilter and don't know what to do with yourself, and or some don't. So I ended up signing up for Iditarod. I had run dogs for 15 years at that point. And my son had already run it with somebody else's dogs and had said under the finish line, knowing how much I loved our dogs and how committed I was to the sport and camping with them and working with them, he said, "Mom, you've got to do this." So in a fit of passion, I agreed and said, "Oh, I've got to do this. I have this chance. How could I turn it down?" I ran the race. It took me 2 tries, as you know, to get to the finish line. The race was nothing like I had imagined it would be. I had been pretty good at the short distances. I'd won my share of shorter races, but I had a healthy respect for going that far, and I never thought I would be competitive, but I thought I would do well on the trail with my dogs over an extended period of time. And the fact that I had to scratch in 800 miles into the first race and call it quits because my dogs had lost their confidence was devastating to me. And I ran the race again. We did get to the finish line, but it was not a run of great poise and beauty. It was riddled with trouble, as most long journeys are, come to find out. And when I got to the finish line, I knew I had lived an incredible adventure, that I had learned way more than I could comprehend right then. And that I wanted really to give something back to this world that had given me such an incredible opportunity. And so I'd always been a sort of a closet writer. And I had done some of my jobs had involved writing newsletters and things like that. And so I set out to write the story of my Iditarods. Now, I thought that would take 2 or 3 years, and immediately ran into roadblocks on that journey. I met with a few editors and agents, and they said, "Oh, you've lived such a great story. Why don't you write it as a woman in a man's world? Or why don't you write about the history of mushing in the Iditarod in Alaska? Or why don't you write about how hard it was on your marriage and how you survived that and you're still married?" And none of those were stories I wanted to write. I wanted to write my own personal story. I wanted to honor the dogs and tell it as it had happened and was interpreted by me. And so I went back to school. I went and got a graduate degree in creative writing, low residence, so I could visit a program in Washington State once a year for 4 years. And then several years after that, I published the book. So it took me 10 years to publish the book, which arguably was harder than completing the Iditarod. So that's my background. That's where I've been. I'm happy to talk to you about any aspect of it. I'm so thrilled to call myself a writer now, or an author. Really am interested in what you all are doing and how what I've done might be of some use.
So when you're ready, just go ahead and unmute, and give voice to your question, or oh wow, you see your face on screen. Or you can ask me to give voice to whatever question you want. But
I was just, I don't like that. Okay.
let's see here.
Try that.
I was just wondering, what's your favorite part of Alaska? Because I've always wanted to go. So, like, if I were to go, like, where would you recommend to go?
Well, Alaska is an incredibly big place. There are multiple land formations, indigenous cultures. The southeastern part of Alaska is the northernmost point of the Pacific rainforest, whereas interior Alaska is the boreal forest. Coastal Alaska is entirely different, way up near Kotzebue and Nome, where the race goes. So, I mean, I would recommend visiting somewhere on the coast and somewhere in the interior to get a real feel for Alaska. If you want to get into the cultural traditions and all that, it would be a totally different answer. And I'm happy to converse with you about that anytime. But it's a very diverse place in land and people. That's probably not a very good answer. We keep our dogs in Denali National Park, just outside the entryway to it. We had them for a long time in Anchorage and Denali, and we'd go back and forth. Right now I'm in Anchorage. We raised our kids in Anchorage, and we did have sled dogs here, but they're kind of better off in a rural area, particularly for the long distance sport.
So my question is, 1 second. Was there any mental battles you had? And if so, what was the hardest and how did you handle it?
Oh, it was all a mental battle. I knew early on writing the book that I was going to write about the collision between daring and doubt, which I thought was all about me. You know, I'm very aware of my doubting my own abilities, and I felt this enormous allegiance to the dogs and how I had to be good enough for them. Like the worst nightmare for me as a musher would be to mishandle the sled, and you know, at 125 pounds, you've got 16 dogs ahead of you when you start that race. It's like you are at the end of a whip, you know, and they go around a corner, and it was all I could do to hang on. And so I trained a lot for my own athletic ability, but I had a lot of doubt. When I started really thinking about, well, really, I was still trying to finish Iditarod when I talked to several mentors about my doubting my own ability. You know, is this something I should be doing? And it was pointed out to me by the race marshal that he has seen every single Iditarod champion cry on the trail, you know, and I mean, these are big heroes up here. I mean, you know, this is, and that was a real eye opener to me. And then I started thinking about various sports and any effort where you're really giving something all you've got. You've got to believe in yourself. Now, I was raised and taught to be very humble and to think of everybody else as more important than I was. I was given a lot of confidence, but I was given what I think is a lot of wisdom from my dad. This came right out of World War II, that he was a captain, but you know, he was on the front lines of battle, and sometimes he had to literally bury the enlisted men that were under him. And he didn't talk about it hardly at all, but he said, you know, I was no better than any of them. And don't you ever forget that, you know? And so anyway, here I am being given the best coaching from a parental social viewpoint. But what that led me into was not this brazen ego, by God, I'm the best out there, we're gonna win. And instead, I sort of carry my humility up front. And that's tricky, because if you don't believe in yourself, your dogs don't believe in themselves. So this is sort of like being a coach that has some inner worries that the bench isn't going to do the job, but he can't tell the bench that, or she can't tell the bench that. You know, those athletes need to go out there feeling like they're going to just win this game. So that was really, really tricky for me, was making a step towards a winning ego, projecting my own success, and being true to myself, which was being acutely aware of what I wasn't. You asked me something else. Where did it play? When was the hardest part of that? Or
Yeah, I asked, what was like the hardest part throughout that journey?
well, the hardest part was getting over feeling like I had failed by not completing the first race. And I insisted on taking the same dogs on the second race. And once dogs start, I mean, you haven't read my book, but basically we got out to the coast, we got off the river and the forested areas of the race, and we were on the coast. And the coast of Alaska, the wind whistles overhead, and it was very windy, and it was very cold. I mean, it was probably 10 below zero, but for the dogs, that's not death cold. You know, that's okay. They like running right around zero or a little below. But the wind and the sound, and I will always believe the smell of the salt, the ice cracks. It's not really flat out there. And we had a 30-mile sea ice crossing, and they were just intimidated. And I wasn't scared of that crossing, but I was tired. We had been out for 10 days. You run dogs around the clock. You sleep for 3 hours here, 2 hours there, maybe 4 hours. That's like a real luxury. And I was really worn down. And when, I don't know how you all are, but when I get worn down, sort of the weakest part of me comes up, and that was the doubt. So I had to get over the fact that I had somehow failed the dogs, and then believe in myself enough to take those same dogs and instill in them the confidence that, by God, we were going to do this and we were going to get there. And that was the whole challenge of it. And they gave me trouble on the sea ice the second time, but I persevered. So I guess it was a battle with myself, really.
Hi. So my question is, I have a pretty athletic dog, but when I like take him on like a 2 mile run, he takes like a 6 hour nap. So I'm wondering like is there like a physical like therapy for a sled dog or something that they do to rest?
So you're asking about the run rest schedule or the training schedule, maybe?
Like I would say like after a race, like what's like the next upcoming week looking like for the dog?
Well, it all begins way back in training. So we start out in the fall, when you're training for a long distance race, we start out running 3-mile runs. And we go very slowly, and we're running them in front of an all-terrain vehicle. And so it's almost like a weight pull for them. They're pulling hard and slowly, and we slowly over months build them up to 50-mile runs. So really in September, we're running 10-mile runs. In October, we're running 20s, and November 30s. And by the first of the year, Iditarod mushers right now are all, even the newest and most sort of conservative mushers are running 50-mile runs right now in preparation for the race. So then you end up narrowing the rest in between those runs. So initially, your first, say, 50-mile run, you might give them 5 days off after that. So they, and they're so tough, and they don't show soreness. One of my dogs, I could tell when a shoulder was a little bit stiff because of the way he would just tilt one ear. And really, when you think about it, it was probably his neck where it was showing up first. But, some dogs hold their tails a little differently when I'm not talking about limping. Once the dog is really limping, you've got an issue, and you have to lay that dog off. You have to massage the dog. You have to figure out what it is. So being the coach is to figure out what's what all along. Now, if you want to build your dog up to going more than 2 miles, you're going to need to maybe start at 1 mile and give it a couple days off, and then another mile, and then build it up to 2 miles. Maybe that dog takes a 6-hour nap, but then, if you're going to go 3 miles, give it a lot of time off before you do that. And pretty soon those naps won't be quite so long. Does that make sense? I mean, it's just really think about it. Many of you, I'm sure, if you're not athletes, are associated with people who are athletes, or you admire people that are athletes, and it's all in the training. Then you have to figure out if your dog really likes to run or not. Because if your dog doesn't really like to run and he's going to sleep because he's sort of depressed, well, that's a whole other story.
There's a question here, but I wondered how many of those 50 miles a day would you say you ran as a musher? You said that the training that you had to go through in order to endure that kind of daily regimen. And how long did those 50 miles take?
Well, I'm not a marathon runner, an ultra marathon runner. The 50 miles with the dog, what you try to do with a long distance dog team is it's all about finding a traveling pace and a run rest cadence that they can sustain. So, and the dogs are very small. I mean, think about marathon runners. They're not huge people, and the dogs are not huge dogs, and they're lean running machines. I did aerobic workouts. Personally, I did a lot of weight training. My upper body's never been the strongest part of me. And when you're handling a sled with a lot of gear in it and all those dogs, you've just got to have a really healthy, strong upper body as much as you can. You get off your runners and pedal. I don't know if you've seen pictures. You've probably have. Are you all familiar with mushing and Iditarod? Did you all get exposed to this as kids in school following the race? Everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? If you don't, say, and I'll backtrack. Okay. So, it's all condition dependent. Most winning teams in Iditarod don't run much faster than 10 to 12 miles an hour. And sled dog teams sprint at 20 miles an hour. So they're perfectly capable of going faster than that. But the difference between how fast my dogs move versus the champions isn't that great, but it's how much rest the champions dogs are trained for and require in between those runs. So I might rest my team 8 hours between 8-hour runs, and the champion might change booties, give them a long snack, half an hour, and go on another 8-hour run and run 16 hours straight. And so, and part of that's because they've bred dogs that are relatively flawless. We have a small backyard dog team. My job as coach was to make the best of what I had, because I was not interested in replacing my dogs for a position in a long distance race. But the people trying to win this game, every single athlete on their teams are usually very well matched, and they run under a higher level expectation. And so most of those animals are pretty perfect athletes, if there is such a thing. They're much more towards perfect than somebody who has 20 to 30 dogs in their backyard like we do.
Sure. Oh, I just had a question, and it's a question I ask like a lot of athletes. And have you ever just like questioned yourself and wondered like why you do this? Like, have you know what I mean? Like, not in a negative way, but just wondering like if it's really like worth it to you, or if you really enjoy it.
Oh yeah. I think every performing athlete asks that, because you give up so much, you know. Now, what happened to us was we were family people. Really, before my husband and I were committed to the family, and the family that grew into kids and dogs. So our dog team was first and foremost for Andy and Hannah from the time they were 5 years old till they were 18. They would race on Saturdays, and then if everybody looked happy, meaning the dogs, I would go into little races on Sunday because I loved racing. But that part all felt very level, and we would sort of balanced with family and sport. We went on spring break, we went on week-long trips with the dogs and camped with them, and we all just loved that. But you see, this isn't purely an individual sport the way swimming or track or a team sport, even like I don't know, baseball. It's really a lifestyle. I mean, you're caring for these animals 24/7. And so now I'm in my mid-60s, my husband's 70, and we're trying to figure out what to do. We have 11 beloved dogs. We have a couple that works for us. They run them more than I do now. The dogs are fine. They've got us and this couple. The couple is ecstatic because they get to run dogs as if they're their own, and we're paying the bills. But we're spending our retirement money so our dogs can live out their lives, seeing us half the time and seeing the handlers half the time. Is that worth it? I don't know, but these dogs are part of our family. They're our life story. They're the sport. They're the heartthrob that we've centered our passion around. And it's the only way we know to sort of ease out of this.
Yeah.
So it's my honest answer then and
Thank
now.
you.
It's tricky. I have a brother-in-law who was an Olympic sailor. Tough times for them, because for years, their household revolved around going to the Olympics and nothing else. And that's really tricky.
Something I thought of that it seems like you've almost kind of answered is, do you think of yourself as more of like a participant or a coach, or is there really not a comparison that could be made?
Oh, with mushing, it's really both. There's no question. An old crusty dog musher who was probably younger than I am now when I decided he was an old crusty dog musher told me, Debbie, you can't push a rope, you know, I mean, you can't make the dogs run. You can't. It's about motivation. It's about your intuition with the animals. For me, it's that beautiful seeking out that moment where it all just comes together. And all these dogs, if you have 8 dogs on the line, you know, you've got 4 pairs of 2. Well, the pairing is really important. One dog will go out front with her best buddy, but she won't run with the gal behind her worth a darn. So there's so many different angles to it. And that's the coaching part, but you are also one with them, literally. You let go of the sled and fall off, they will go for a very long time before they stop and wait for you, if they ever do. I did have a dog team turn around and come back for me once, which was purely a reflection of an extraordinary leader. But, you know, and when I saw, again, this is one of the beauties of these big goals where everything else falls aside, the household, everything else you do falls aside when you sign up for Iditarod. It's all you can think about, and you're doing everyone around you a disservice if you don't throw everything you've got into it, because then you're going to keep on trying, right? So the best thing you can do for your family or anybody else that you think you're dragging along with you, which is something I worried about, is forget all of them for a while and just do it. But as soon as you have a big goal like that, and I don't care whether you're a human weightlifter or a dog musher, you're learning so much more. And one thing I learned so much more right away, you know, I signed up for Iditarod in a fit of passion for these dogs and where our family had been, and the kids were gone, and I was worried about the empty nest. And I signed up, and the next day I was like, oh, can I do this? Am I good enough for these animals? And I carried that determination and that question with me all the way to the finish line.
Hi, how's it going? I have a question about you as an author. What is the most rewarding part about writing a book? And why did it take you so long to write it? Because you said it took 10 years. I'm just curious.
Well, the most rewarding part, and I'm not just being cute here, is to do stuff like this. First of all, I don't think any of you have probably read my book, but you're familiar with my story through my book. And believe it or not, I learn more from these discussions about my own book. And it's very gratifying to share with people and to share different angles of what I experienced. And, you know, I was thinking about this when I wrote the book between 2006 and 16, on the topic of sexism. People would say to me, you know, why don't you write about how hard it was to be in a man's world? And my answer always was, you know, our sport is pretty gender blind. I mean, most of my musher friends are men because there are more men than women in the sport, but I've got good friends who are women, and we all bring our different strengths to it. And I've never felt much tension from a gender perspective. Okay, so that was my lens in 2016. So, and I didn't want to write a book about all that anyway. And so now we're living in a different point in time with the Me Too movement and all these other shortcomings in our culture that we've really focused in on recently. And now I see the sexist thread that runs all through my book and how the trail sweep, you know, was a real jerk to me when he pulled me off the sea ice and he told me to get in that sled and not to be tending to my dogs anymore. He was going to get them out safe and sound. And if I had to pee, not to tell him to stop because he wasn't going to wait for me and all this. And at the time I thought, well, that guy was just a bad human being. And, you know, now I think he never would have talked that way to a man ever, you know? So, So I think when you write a book, you write through your lens that you are seeing it through at that point in time. And so just thinking about your class and all these different issues you're talking about has taught me that. So you asked me about why did it take me? Why? So can you ask me the question again? I think I
Yeah,
asked.
you said it took 10 years, right? How many pages is your book? And why did it take so long to write that book?
Well, the book is a normal length book, so it's I don't know, 280 pages. I needed to learn how to write better. And I also needed to figure out what story, I needed to find my authentic voice. And that is something that just took me a while, but I'm writing a new book now, and it's not probably going to take me 10 years. Without the pandemic, it might have taken 3 or 5, but it's still a very long process to figure out what your story is and get into it and tell it the way it does. It can fly, because we're not journalists, and we're not putting a series of photos of an event on the page. In the case of writing memoir, if you've lived a great story like I did, you have to figure out what to leave out. And that's really hard. If you're a fiction writer, say you're writing a story about a musher who fails once and goes back again, then you have to figure out what to put in, So it's just a long process. The beginning of my book, I have 2 epigraphs in the book, one at the beginning and one in the middle. And the first half of my book is about my first race, and the second is staged in my second race. But each half of my book has as much backstory as it does the racing in it. So, but the scaffolding around my book are these 2 races. And the epigraph in the first one is, "To see far as one thing, going there is another." And that's a quote from an artist that I studied in college named Constantine Brancusi. And it really reflects my sort of romantic passion as a person, all the way up to signing up for Iditarod, because I've always wanted to do these grandiose things. And some of them I've been advised not to do. It would be either irresponsible or a little out of reach or whatever. And some I've gone for. And the epigraph in the second half of the book, which is after I've taken my knocks and I'm going to try again, is from a William Stafford poem. And it's called Practice. And it's really about practicing for a theatrical or musical performance. But I think it applies incredibly well to sport practice and to writing practice. And it was actually put on the wall in the beginning of a writing workshop in graduate school. And the last line of it is, "Maybe your stumbling saves you, and that sound in the night is more than the wind." And so writing, as in sport, as in art, the rough drafts matter. And it's very, very discouraging to me to this day to circle around and work on chapter 3 again of this new thing that I've got a couple hundred pages written on already. But there's no way that stumbling and fumbling around isn't going to be worthwhile in the end. And it just requires a lot of patience. And the end is rewarding, but really not because you get there. I mean, yeah, I like holding a book in my hand. That's fine. But what I really like is what it gives even me, the author, after it's all said and done, because the cycling of the story continues, and it continues in my head. And that's really why I love being a writer.
Thank you.
I just had a question. I know that you said you did like weight training, and then you also talked about how the dogs are really comfortable in the temperatures that you were in, but like I was just wondering, like, was there any preparation put into like how the cold might affect you, or like, did you have like survival training? Cause like, I know like frozen environments can be very unpredictable and like really unsafe if something bad happens. So I was just wondering like, what kind of precautions did you take to make sure that you were okay?
So one of the, my editor said to me, can't you talk more about how cold you were? And actually the truth of the matter is I wasn't that cold. And part of it is because when you live in a cold environment, you do acclimatize to some extent, but you also, I mean, I had done winter climbing, winter skiing, winter camping for a lifetime by the time I went on Iditarod. So I knew exactly how to deal with all of that. And it goes from nutrition. I mean, if you don't eat well out there, you might perish. There's no question. First long distance dog race I went in, I thought, oh, I'm going to take care of my dogs before I take care of me. I'm going to feed them really well. And I'm not going to do anything for me until I get indoors for the layover, which was on the floor of a gas station in the middle of nowhere. But anyway, and I went in on that race to lie down to go to sleep, and I stuffed my face right before I went to sleep, and I had 6 hours to stay there, and I shivered for the first 3 hours because I had let myself go way metabolically low, and then I couldn't sleep, and then I finally warmed up enough to go to sleep, and I slept for about 20 minutes, and then my alarm went off, and I was competitive enough that I wanted to get out because the dog schedule was different than mine. They were ready to eat another meal. And I left on a 100-mile run, and that's the only dog race I've ever completely hallucinated in all the way home. So for those 100 miles. So I learned right then and there that's sort of a cliche. Take care of your dogs and they'll take care of you. You have to take care of yourself as well so that you can take care of your dogs. And then, yes, they do take care of you. But that was a real misnomer for me. The dogs they're required to have double coats, which means they shed, and they have 2 kinds of fur, but we do a lot to protect them mostly from the wind. So we put them in dog coats. One reason they wear booties is to protect their feet from snowballs getting into their feet, but it also keeps them, their body core temperature more regulated. And we know when to stop, and mushers crawl into their sleds. They dig holes in the snow for the dogs to sleep in. And if you get in a really bad storm and you curl up, the snow insulates you and them. And that's a survival technique that I never had to pull out on my Iditarods, but it is something I've thought about in other circumstances. But again, you got to take care of yourself, and you've got to have all this knowledge and then a lot of experience. The other thing that's crazy is at the end of my races, I was doing things barehanded at 0, that if I had tried 3 months earlier in the winter, I would never have been able to do that without my fingers getting probably frost nipped. So as much as you all get used to the heat, and I go to California, maybe not San Francisco, but down south, and it's over like 70 degrees. I am miserable. I am so uncomfortable because I'm so hot. So if you all came up and stayed with us for a couple months, we'd get you used to the cold too.
Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty cool. And then like, at your like layovers, do they have supplies for you for the dogs, or do you have to carry around all the food yourself?
No, so we're out there, like my races took just under a couple weeks. And so you send out what's called drop bags. So it's provisions for you and your dogs. And we send them out to each of 22 checkpoints. So, and it's all flown in, bush planes and volunteer pilots. And so we send out what we're going to eat, what the dogs are going to eat, to each checkpoint. And in that process, that's all due in mid-February. The race starts the first Saturday of March. You really have to have the blueprint for your entire routine in those bags. And that's a whole other challenge. And if there's one thing I improved most on my second race than my first, was my management of all those provisions and how that became a template for my routine with the dogs. Because when you get really tired, you want to be nimble enough to respond to the dog that has a food preference or a need to have a massage or whatever, but you want your basic routine to be the same every single time. Because if you have all those, you have a million different options in those drop bags and a million different ways you can get food in them and diets and all this stuff, it just really screws you up.
Yeah.
First race, I saw those drop out. You pull into a checkpoint and you're directed to park your dogs. And I would see my bags, and my bags were twice as big as anybody else's because I was very studious about it. I talked to like 3 different champions about what their routine was. And I made the huge error of trying to incorporate a little of this one and a little of that routine and a little of the other person's. And my drop bags were enormous. I had so much flexibility. I just loathed opening them and wondering why the heck I sent out this or that or the other thing. So
Yeah.
again, it was like in writing, you have to find your own voice. I had to find my own, I had to find out what worked for me and my dogs. Not the agent, not what would work for the editor, not what would work for Martin Boozer or Jeff King or Doug Swingley, who are the champions of those days. It was what was going to work for me.
Mhm.
And then I had to have confidence in that.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you.
Sometimes I think that if I could just remember my Iditarod lessons when I'm working on this new book, I could do it much better. But you forget your own lessons because there are a lot of them.
Yeah, you do that teaching too. Your best advice, you think, oh, right,
Right.
maybe I should take that. Including, by the way, any assignment that you have that you feel like you want to go another direction on in this class. The answer is absolutely yes. Just let's talk about it. Debbie, would you mind reading some of the book so that we can hear the voice that you arrived at? We talked earlier about your choice to use the first person present tense to bring us right into the action. So that was something we're just now as writers starting to figure out, that there are these small ways to bring the audience completely with you. But
That's a controversial choice to use present tense. I had a mentor at graduate school that begged me to stop it because it's much easier to reflect in past tense than it is in present. But I just could not tell this story in anything other than present tense, although I do go back and forth with the flashbacks. So do you have a suggestion of what you would like me to read, Mary?
I was thinking on that first ice flow. I think it was on mine is a Kindle. So
The 8 a.m. Is that
in the first trip, the ice flow on the first trip.
this is when my dog team stopped really for the first time.
Yeah, the sea ice chapter.
Mhm. And use
Anywhere in there, but it was like 8 a.m. and you're ready to go. And then
and then it all falls apart.
yeah, I mean, I'm having you read the part where it falls apart, but
Okay, let me look. I mean, I just don't want to read too long, and I want to get to the part.
well, if you have a place you'd rather read, by all means,
I don't usually, frankly, as much as I say that stumbling saves you, I always find this mutiny scene a little embarrassing. I have read it some. Okay, I'll read a couple pages. Is that about right?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So I'm in a place called Shaktoolik, which is a big, long spit of land that is melting into eroding into the sea these days. But I was there, the wind whips through there, and I'm ready to head out with the dogs on the 30-mile crossing of the Norton Sound. And I am tired, they're tired, but we haven't had any real issues. In hindsight, I can see problems, but this is the exact run when things begin to fall apart. So I've slept in this schoolhouse on the ground, on the floor for probably 4 hours. And the wind is just zzz, all around the house. Dogs, of course, are outside. I'm leaving my favorite leader in the hands of the veterinarians there. She hated cold weather and wind, and she was not happy, so I left her. And here we go. At 8 a.m., we're ready to go. And mind you, that could be 1 a.m. It doesn't matter what time, doesn't matter what, when your layover's over, you go. And often you choose to run during the night. And actually, this story might not even happened if I'd left during the night, because the dogs might not have seen the white and not have been so disoriented. But we left at 8 a.m. because it was light out and I wanted to see where I was going. It's 8 a.m. We're ready to go. I've eaten a 3-egg omelet and fed the dogs a double meal. I'm donning every piece of available clothing. Over the usual 3 layers and my snowsuit, I've added insulated pants and another down parka. Then an oversized white anorak designed for Arctic weather. My sled bag is cinched tight, dog coats are securely fastened, and the dogs' booties are on. I motioned to Kelly, another musher, that she should go first. When she claps her hands and says hike, her huskies stand. A few stretch, others look stiff. They move at a slow walk around the corner of the building and are gone. Rhodey, the trail judge, helps me arrange my dogs, clipping Piney into Juliet's empty place next to Teton. Fly safely home, I tell Juliet out loud, like she's my good luck ladybug. She's already been taken off the line, and actually she's out of sight, but I whisper again, fly safely home. Then to the others I call, let's go. They shake off sleep and stand. A few kind villagers guide us around the building and over an icy snowbank. They shout farewell, and I hold on tight as the team scrambles down a bluff to what looks like a beach. A gust swirls around us, but the dogs trudge on. They move past several markers to an enormous orange fabric fence positioned to protect the village from drifting snow. As we approach, it flaps an ominous rattle. When we round it, we face directly into a fierce and frigid gale. Kanga is in single lead. She's led so well that last mile into Unalakleet, I'm confident she's up to this challenge. Now she slows, sniffs the ground, and stops. Quickly, I run to her side. What's up, girl? Do you need company? I'll put little Sue up. Good girls, I praise them, clipping little Sue at Kanga's side. After patting them both, I hustle to my sled, assuming the problem is solved. I pull my snowhook anchor out of the ice and call hike. No one budges. Little Sue and Kanga stand still. Roulette and Strider sit down. At first, I wonder what I've missed. The wind is blowing, but at least it's daytime. This is nothing compared to last night when we ran in through the gale. Not wanting to ask too much of little Sue, I take her out of lead and put Tyga up with Kanga. They move a few steps until Kanga sits and Tyga rolls in the snow. Now I choose Creek. Good girl, I tell her, putting her in lead for the first time in the whole race. This is your chance. It takes a minute for me to reorder the team. Little Sue and Creek are buddies, so I put them in lead together. Satisfied that everyone should be pleased with an exciting new arrangement, I cry, let's go. And they do. They trot for several minutes. I'm thinking that, of course, everything is fine when Nacho stops to relieve himself and everyone else decides he has a great idea. Spot and Zeppy lift their legs, a few girls squat, and Roulette and Kanga sit down. No, I call with heightened alarm. Again, I rearrange everyone and plead, let's go. My dogs tune me out. With heads hanging, they look off to the side. When I wipe the frost from her muzzle, Kanga pulls away. Little Sue pretends I'm not here. After trying every possible combination, I position myself alongside little Sue in lead. When I ask the team to follow, she and I tug them to their feet. My huskies must be surprised to see me up front. At first, they agree to move, but a jolt of momentum jerks the riderless sled, which nudges the wheel dogs in the butt. Insulted, wheel dogs Spot and Creek sit down, and so do the others. The rejection is unbearable. I go back to being the musher. Oh,
One of the reasons I asked for that section too is there was a question over here. Oh, I think it was over here about what happens if the dogs don't go? Like, what do? You just, you
well,
don't go.
you don't go. I mean, I was, lots of people felt badly for me. I mean, I was lots of mushers. And, my family was in Nome and the banquet was 2 nights away, and they get the message during the banquet that Debbie Moderow is scratched, and evidently the mushers all groaned like, oh, and this is a place where this happens every year. I mean, some very famous mushers have lost the race when this happens. It's just that I was giving them ample rest. You heard in there that I fed them a double meal. I think that was an error. I was giving them 10 Big Macs at mile 23 of a marathon. I mean, I don't think this was all me. This was me nurturing, me feeling, oh, you're getting thin, it's a little colder. I'm going to give you a double meal. I shouldn't have done that. I was already feeding them tons, but nothing could have felt worse to me than that. And I'm sorry, Mary, what did you ask me?
No.
You can see I get back there. And
That was it. But one of the things that we're writing about too is sometimes those negative, those failures are so key to our stories, and to ignore them is to let them drive you unconsciously. And it sounds like you've confronted it very deliberately, both in this book itself, but also in the decision to race again.
Well, I got letters from school kids saying, good luck next year. And last thing I wanted to do was run it the next year. And actually, I gave the next year to my husband to run because I felt like it was his fair turn. He had done so much to support me. It had been a hard winter. I hadn't gotten there. I was discouraged. And I said, you run, I'll probably run again, but not this year. And so the next year he ran. And he did not take all the same dogs. The dogs started acting up on him, and we got some veteran Iditarod dogs in his team. And I ended up having to be his coach, which was a whole other story about coaching, which was really not anything I wanted. And I think he wanted it more than I did. And he did make it to Nome, and that was my green light to try again. But these letters from school kids, like, are you ever going to go again? You need to go again. You need to get through what hung you up. And I preach that to my own children, but that's really what made me go again, was that the voice of people like that. Oh, I know what I was going to say. One musher said to me, Debbie, you are not a dog driver because you run only on positive reinforcement for this dog team. And he said, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a lot of work. And he said, you have to show your dogs everything they might see out there. He said, you should go train on the coast, or whenever there's a lot of wind, you need to get out there because you are a dog manager. You're not a dog driver. You're not going to growl at their dogs and get them to go because you never growl at them. And so they're just going to think you're crazy, or they're going to be more discouraged, which was true. I mean, I did get mad at them at one point, and then they were like, we're not going to run. You just yelled at us, And so, again, I had to believe in my own style, and I had to be patient and whimsical. And, when my dog started not sitting down on the ice on the second race, I knew they were arrested, and I knew I was feeding them right. And at one point, a raven flew by. I saw a pair of ravens actually coming down the river, and I thought, oh, let's go chase that raven. And I got them all up, and we did. That's what got them moving, is chasing a raven. But I had to have sort of the whimsy and the patience and the imagination to try that. And that was one time when I got them going again. But they got in a bad habit, those dogs. So
Yeah, I have 2 more questions. If there's anybody else who has a question in here, please raise your hand. I'll hand you over. But one question is, just how much does it cost if you do it as cheaply as you possibly can to race the Iditarod, and I guess I'm counting all the training that's involved in dog food and.
It's a hard question because inflation is making it much more expensive now than it used to be. We used to say $1 a dog a day. Now it's probably $2 to $3 a dog a day. And that's if you have the equipment. I mean, if you already own the equipment these days and you sign up for the race, there's a $4,000 entry fee. You're going to put $4,000 to $5,000 into your drop bags. That's $10,000. You're probably going to spend $25,000 on a given race. And that's if you already own the dogs and are living the lifestyle.
No, okay.
I mean, we didn't go on vacations forever. I mean, this is what we did. I mean, we did, but we were camping with our dogs. Our friends would go to Hawaii for spring break and we'd go camping in a tent and we loved it. We wouldn't trade that for anything, but it was a lifestyle.
I did see that you went to Arizona recently, or was it Utah?
I
Yeah.
went to Arizona and all our friends up here, everybody loves the Southwest up here. And I think there's similarities, but it's warm and, the swing season, it's great. And I was like, wow, look at this place. And so I got a bunch of texts back saying, it's about time you went down there. So
The last question I had is, you're racing male and female dogs together. Is there any difference in their capacity to pull? Is there any metabolic difference, or are dogs pretty much equal, male and female physiques?
I thought I might get that question. This is one of these things that I just think the jury's out on that. They're not the same. I prefer running light female leaders. That said, my heartthrob dog, who isn't showing his face right now, is this enormous male husky. I was told early on in this sport that most winning dogs in most winning teams were males. I'm not sure that's true anymore. And I think that might be in the eye of the beholder.
Thank you.
Our dog team, there is a management issue when the females come into heat. And one of the tricks of that is to put all the girls out front and the guys run like crazy, but that's also systemic because the girls want to go back to all these templates are all a little flawed. I think smaller dogs, the females are usually smaller than the males, not always. And they're less prone to injury. And I think a lot has to do, more than male, female, a lot has to do with the bloodlines. They're all mutts, and where you get your dogs from, those bloodlines have a lot to do with whether the dog is more hard-headed or more sensitive. And we were sold a lot of sensitive dogs from champions because they knew I wasn't going to take a run at the championship of this big race. And they knew I had the patience to work with a sensitive dog, and I actually prefer that. So we ended up with fabulous bloodlines that, interestingly enough, the top men and women in the sport wanted us to breed for them. And I wasn't into that either. So we ended up with top bloodlines and of sensitive dogs. And, I might have had an easier race, but I wouldn't have learned half as much, and I wouldn't have written a book about it. So I feel like it all worked out.
Question over here.
Is there Dan muted?
You're unmuted.
So I had a question about, you mentioned like the different coaching styles of dogs and how like some prefer to coach their dogs more harshly, or you said you prefer to coach yours more patiently, and you prefer to deal with sensitive dogs. What's your take on that in terms of like, because I know like a lot of sports, they work their animals really hard. I think about like track racing and dog racing, and they push their animals really hard. And I was just wondering your take on that.
Well, my take on that is pretty harsh against harsh coaching of animals. I think every professional coach of an animal needs to look themselves in the mirror really hard and ask whether their ego is driving an unfair bargain with the animal. Now, that said, I can speak to dog mushing. I'm a pretty much of a purist dog trainer in using only positive reinforcement and diversion. And that's pretty much how we raised our kids too. So we ended up with sassy kids. Our kids will tell us exactly what they think at any moment. And we like it that way. We have a very hearty debate about a whole lot of things. Well, obviously my dogs told me exactly what they thought on the sea ice. I think there's plenty of room to the more disciplined approach to coaching compared to me that is super humane, just more demanding, and in some ways more consistent. I was feeding Juliet herring to get her to run, and I was feeding Zeppy, big hunks of meat. Well, that wore me down. I got tired having a separate kind of menu for Juliet. And so yet I kept Juliet happy, and I wanted to run Iditarod with Juliet. And if I wanted to have a whole team of Zeppies, I could have, but I didn't want that. So it kind of depends on your own personal style. But I think as humans, we owe horses, dogs, whatever other species there are, our highest respect. And mushers pretty much police other mushers. When there's a bad actor in our game, the mushers pretty much will call that person out.
Yeah.
And nothing's perfect.
And then I had another question about, like, for you, when you started out doing this for the first time, like, who kind of coached you or taught you, or did you kind of self-teach? Or
No, the person that gave us Salt, our first dog, got us our start in mushing. And that family, he was an Iditarod musher, and his wife was the one that made it all happen. And she was my friend. And so she wanted to get on the runners herself, because she had been living a somewhat, a very, very, very supportive role in their Iditarod family. And so she and I became super good friends, and she taught me, and I can't believe I did this now because I would never do this with my grandchildren. Here I was, a brand new musher, putting 4-year-old Hannah in my sled basket, following Jeanette with her 4-year-old in her sled basket. And I would fall off, and the sled would go barreling down the trail with my 4-year-old daughter in it and the dogs, and they'd run up on Jeanette, who was extremely proficient on a dog team. And she would stop her own team and grab my dogs and hold the sled for me while I came back and jumped back on, and off we'd go again. I have a lot more fear of what might happen to a young child in my sled basket now than I did then. But anyway, I was mentored by that family. And in terms of racing, I really, my relationship with dogs came from my relationship with our dogs. Went back to our hunting dogs that doubled as dogs that slept on my bed at night. They hunted with my dad and mom and brother on the weekends, but did everything with me all week long. And we always sort of mixed up the working dog, family dog thing. And I spent a lot of time with horses in Wyoming. And I was around some rough, tough cowboys down there, but the people that really impressed me were the people that had a real intuitive way with the horse and a gentle touch to get the same response. So it's just what I was drawn to. Again, it came from my very lovely parents.
Any other questions?
I can certainly talk more about the writing part. I feel like I've talked a lot about the sport part.
Any questions about just I guess, we talked really briefly about how you were using the race itself as a structure to kind of anchor the story going forward, and how difficult it was now that you're writing a book without that essential structure to find kind of a narrative through line or a momentum forward. And what advice do you have for them? Because they're all writing now personal history of sport, but we're not mandating exactly what structure that takes. Maybe some sort of event around which the narrative coalesces, but beyond that, what having written this book about a race, we've got some runners who are actually not here because they're running.
Right?
But what other sports? So just name some sports, everyone, that you're writing about. So there's lacrosse, basketball, soccer, lacrosse, yeah. Maybe softball. So we've got these events that have inbuilt narratives and in the game itself. What advice would you have, given what you've done already, for somebody, for example, who's a lacrosse player or a soccer player, about organizing those things? Tough question, actually.
Well, I mean, now I'm in that seat of those editors and agents where I said, oh, I'm cool. I ran this race and I was the hard luck kid. And then I tried again. And they'd say, can you tell me more about the history? Like, I want to know the history of, I mean, lacrosse to me is the sport that I've played, and it's so beautiful and it's so steeped in cultural tradition and history. And it's such a beautiful, beautiful sport. So I want to know, I'd love to read a really great book about lacrosse or an essay or whatever. So here's the thing. I think that the sport, something has drawn you to that sport, and just call it, for me, it was the dogs, the Alaskan terrain, winter, snow, and a goal. That's what drew me to Iditarod in very simplified terms. But what was really going on? So I had to bring the reader into, really, for me, it was the hero's journey, trying to get somewhere, having a big crash, trying to get there again. What did I learn? For you, whether it's whatever the sport has given you, maybe just one of those aha moments where you're doing what you're meant to do, or maybe you admire somebody, or maybe you've tried to do something and you're not good at it, but you still love it, or it's a family tradition, whatever. But the sport itself is kind of a vehicle to set the stage, but you're the main character if it's a personal history. And so what's really going on? For me, it was a wrestling match of daring versus doubt. And it took me the longest time to figure that out. Yeah, I circled around that, but it was well into graduate school, which means I was like 6 years into a 10-year project at least, when I was talking to a friend who was already a published writer, and she was teasing questions out of me. What's it really about? What's it really about? And I would get so mad saying, I've told you what it's really about. What's it really about? And I realized right then it was really about that conflict within me between daring and doubt. And what it took to work through that, and what did I learn in that process? And I did learn that the triumph wasn't anything compared to the bigger lessons. So what is it really? What is your personal investment within that scaffolding of the lacrosse stick or the basketball court, or the many, many times you need to practice or train, or the disappointment or the triumph, but what's really going on? Or what's going on socially, what's it like to be a woman musher in a man's world? What is it like to straddle that line between coach and athlete, which is what I was.
I think that's great advice. So all of these options, you have to arrive at one and trust that one is going to lead you forward. Even if all these other aspects of the story are there and present, they're not the focus. They're the subplots.
Whatever story you tell has to feed that focus. It has to elaborate on that focus. Because when you are writing memoir of any length or sort, you know so much more than that story is really going to be about. So when you figure out what the you part of that story within that sport is, and sport's just a metaphor for life, and it's a beautiful metaphor, and it draws people in, and it drew you in and me in and everybody else. But what within that court or playing field or trail, why was your humanity on the line, and what did you wrestle with?
Yeah, that's great advice. I think we are just about out of time. This has been wonderful. You go ahead and unmute yourselves. It's going to be cacophonous because it's going to overlap too, but go ahead and unmute yourselves and give Debbie a hand. You can hear us.
Well, thanks. You know, I learned more. I learned plenty doing this. I told that to
This
you before, and I did. So, because I haven't done a discussion about sport and writing before.
well, this may not be your last time. I might be
I
calling you
very
again.
much enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I hope I
good.
answered the questions. Mary, you are very, I'm going to send you the Stafford poem. Oh, I guess I finally did.
You did, and I have
Um,
it. I'll have it for him on the board here. So
I think you can, it's got a piano in there. It's a theater practice, but I think you could put in a basketball hoop or whatever you wanted.
all right.
And feel free to give them my email address. I'll answer any questions or read anything or converse further on any topic. I'm happy to.
Oh, thank you, Debbie. Thank you again. Thanks very much. We want to mute, but you can see all of them behind me.
Oh, look at that. I didn't know you were around a circle. That's even
Yeah.
better.
Yeah, I've been walking around the circle. So thanks very
Awesome.
much. We'll
All
talk
right.
again.
You have a good one.
I owe you coffee or something. You come down here. There, one of the
Gotta
two.
get together. That'll be really fun.
Yes. Yeah.
Good.
Take care.
Thanks, Mary. Bye.